Is my mic on? Yeah, good. Welcome to everybody on this Zoom webinar, and welcome to everybody watching live through YouTube. My name is Darius. I'm the CEO of the SASI, and I have the honor today to kick off this webinar series about leadership in sustainability, co-produced by the SASI and Y East. Now, before I introduce today's topic, let me say a few words about our company. The SASI is a sustainability agency that was founded 2 years ago by 46 alumni of the Masters in Sustainability and Social Innovation program at HEC Paris. Now, we come from 25 countries and we speak 15 languages. And today we leverage our diversity to make sustainability accessible to companies and individuals. What we offer is what we call the SASification path. So what is that? First, we inspire with our team building climate workshops that we call Climate Breakdown. And the free online version of that is launching later this week, so stay tuned for that. Next, we build stakeholder community models. What that means is that we help companies create self-sustaining communities and stakeholder-centric business models. And finally, we lock in by guiding our clients through impact measurement and the B Corp certification. Now, this first episode in the webinar series is called Why Sustainability Needs More Women in Power. At the SASI, 60% of our co-founders are women, which of course contributes to a balanced leadership. However, in the world at large, we are far from achieving gender balance, let alone sustainability. And this is why I'm very grateful that we could partner with Y East to bring you this webinar. And I'd like to introduce Pauline to you, who I of course know as a fellow SASI, but who is also the co-founder and CEO of Y East. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Darius. So hi again, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I just will take 1 minute to introduce you to Y East. So Y East is typically an aggregating professional platform for actors of the social and sustainability sectors based out of Kolkata, India, with a specific focus on East and Northeast India. So proudly representing here mostly the eastern region of India, as well as my home country, which is France, and also as a co-founder of the SASI. And I am very, very happy to be part of this first webinar and this very first initiative in collaboration between Y East and the SASI, which basically will lead us to further partner in the future to open opportunities and knowledge opportunities and different products related to sustainability and taking them from France to India. So thank you so much, Darius, again. Now I have the pleasure to invite Sushil to follow suit and introduce to everyone a very special guest that we have today with us.
Okay, thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Darius. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar. And I would like to invite Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who is the founder and the CEO of the organization CEEW, which is the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. So before we get into the panel discussion, I would like Dr. Arunabha to set the stage. So introduce about the organization and also talk about his views and opinions on the webinar topic, which is why sustainability needs more women in power. So over to you, Dr. Arunabha.
You're muted, sir. Can you unmute yourself so we can hear you?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hear me now? Yes. Good afternoon,
Yes.
everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. It's an issue that is very much close to my heart. Both the issue of sustainability as well as the role of women in leadership positions in this, not just in the sector, but overall. So let me just offer some overall thoughts to kind of frame the discussion that will follow. And I know two of my colleagues, Sasmita Patnaik and Konkani Kanyog, will be speaking later, and I'd love to hear what they have to say. But let me start by stating that, when we talk about leadership and uh, the representation of different uh, classes of society, different genders, people from different backgrounds in leadership positions, it should be at one level of, at a sort of level of first principles, should be a hygiene matter. What I mean by hygiene matter is it should be obvious. If women, I'm notwithstanding skewed sex ratios in different countries, if on average we say that women are 50% of the population, then there should be 50% of representation. And that I would apply a similar principle to many other kind of ways in which we can signify our diversity, whether it's class, whether it's social status, and so forth. But in particular, we treat this issue as something that has to be explained again and again, not because the explanation itself is wrong or unnecessary. It's because we have not internalized this basic hygiene matter, and nor have we internalized the structural inequalities and biases that exist. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an internal discussion within CEW about the structural biases that exist even within our own minds, even if we were women, where we were thinking about what comes to our mind when we think of somebody in a leadership position. And even many women that we kind of ran this kind of social experiment with struggle to kind of overcome that bias that has been culturally ingrained in our upbringing or in the society that we see around us. But there are biases that exist beyond just what is internal to our own thinking or our own sort of cultural kind of context. And those biases need to be addressed in a very systematic manner. And that requires a removal of certain fears. And I call it, the one thing is this atmosphere of fear that many women feel when they are not just in the workspace, but particularly in the sustainability space, whether it's doing field work, whether it's in an office setting, etc. We need to be able to ensure that we are not just solving for or providing for justice once kind of we become aware of predatory behavior towards women, but we are trying to create a safe space for all in advance so that there is a trust in the institutions and the broader workspaces within which we work. The second kind of intervention that is needed is in making sure that we are consistent with the processes that we establish to deal with issues and challenges that women are facing, and that we consistently apply those processes. It is often the dilution of very well written down documents, etc., that then dilutes the trust that many people have in an institution or in the workspace. And that then results in a sort of self-selection of themselves out of any desire to progress their careers. The third aspect has to be that we have to make sure that any kind of sense of helplessness that women might feel because they raise so-called uncomfortable issues and those are then dismissed or ridiculed should be handled not just with sensitivity but with a robust approach throughout the organization. And finally, we have to make sure that these embedded cultures of discrimination that exist, whether it is just gender focused or whether it is a combination of gender, come class, come religion, etc., that creates a confluence of discriminations that people face, we need to tackle all of these. Now, these are some of the kind of, as I said, the hygiene matters that need to be handled without which we are not going to get adequate representation. But then let me come in the remaining 2-3 minutes of my opening remarks to how does this then link with sustainability per se. In CEW, we launched a program called Women in Sustainability. Internally, we launched it about 3.5 years ago, and formally 3 years ago, just under 3 years ago, and Sasmita and Konkanika will talk more about it. But the idea was that, or the idea was premised on two things. One, as I said earlier, we need more women in leadership positions. But two, that women in leadership positions in the domain of sustainability will ensure that the priorities of sustainability that we set us before ourselves, whether as an institution or as a country or as a planet, will get achieved better. Whether you look at the SDGs now, or you look at the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them, or you look at the Human Development Paradigm that preceded or formed the foundation of these conversations, we see that the empirical evidence is very clear. The investment in women and girls and women in their education and their healthcare significantly has the maximum impact across most other development parameters. And on top of that, the participation of women in leadership positions, whether in legislatures or in political office or in company boards or in the social sector, again has a demonstrable impact. So then the issue is whether from a hygiene perspective of representation or from an instrumental perspective of if we had more women in leadership positions, these are the broader development gains we would have. We have a case before us, except we don't have sufficient action. And what aggrieves me the most is, I used this phrase earlier, is that this the glass ceiling, whether it's real or perceived or really hard to break, it is the self-selection out of the process of leadership that then perpetuates the biases that we already have. So we are trying very hard at CEW to try and ensure that not just at the recruitment level that we have a large representation of women, but increasingly we are trying to make sure that the middle management level we have large representation of women, so that we are then able to create those career tracks for women to be able to get into the senior management positions. This is not, check the box sort of affirmative action. This has to be affirmative action. It requires proactive intervention to make it happen. And that's just at the level of an institution, but the broader space we are operating in requires these interventions to happen again and again. I just want to close with an example from the field. At CEW, we have been working, among other things, on something called natural farming. It's a large program that the state of Andhra Pradesh has been promoting for the last 5 years. It's the world's largest program, having reached 650,000 farmers already. But it was built on a foundation of women-run self-help groups. That foundation was built between 2000 and 2010 in that state. If that foundation did not exist, the natural farming program would not arise. And in my field visits, what I've observed is that having seen the success of small and marginal women farmers owning a small plot of land, half an acre, etc., and yet increasing their incomes multifold through this kind of social capital of the self-help groups, but of course the intervention of the state, the men in the rural communities in that state have also come together to form their self-help groups to try and kind of replicate the methods and modes. This is just one example. It's not an anecdote, it's much more than an anecdote. But I just wanted to reinforce that the representation of women is a hygiene matter, but the representation of women in leadership positions in the sustainability domain delivers the broader goals that we are aspiring to. Both require very targeted intervention. And I hope that this conversation and many more will yield some of the lessons that we need to invite. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Arunabha, for your thoughts. So let's get into the panel discussion now. So I would like to invite my colleague Julia to take over as the moderator.
Thank you, and great welcoming remarks from everyone. Hi guys, my name is Julia, and I'm a co-founder of the SASI Co, and as well as working at YSL Beauty on communications and sustainability. I would like to start by introducing our panelists. The first is Shasmita, who is the program lead for Women in Sustainability at CEEW. Next, we have Konkanita, program associate for Women in Sustainability, also at CEEW, and Leah Friedman, who is the Entrepreneurship Program Manager of the Social Innovation Accelerator at the Red Cross in France. Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. We all know why we are here today. It's for a very important issue within sustainability, which is women and women in power. We know that it is women who make up 80% of people displaced from climate change, and it is women who are 14 times more likely to die during a climate disaster. So it should come as no shock that climate change disproportionately affects women and girls, precisely because women and girls are already marginalized. And this is why the calls for gender responsive climate action are more and more urgent. Women are also often the eco-leaders of their families and communities, yet at every level of decision-making, from major international organizations to grassroots activism, women are underrepresented. Women are a minority on every major committee of the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, and women account for less than 30% of most major national global climate change negotiating bodies. Therefore, today, we gather together to discuss why sustainability needs more women in power. So without further ado, I would love to hear from our panelists. The first question is on the topic of female leadership. Research has shown that gender balance is particularly important in crisis management. Sustainability is considered an area of constant emergency. So what does that mean for female leadership? Shasmita, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Julia, for the question and for kind of giving me the opportunity to set the context for this. I think sustainability as a sector is not very different when you think of it. It's very similar to other sectors where you see a lot of women joining the sector but dropping out when they reach like the middle management. And a lot of that happens because of competing professional and personal priorities. And when you think about it, when you have a hollow middle, when you don't have enough women in the middle management, who do you kind of, then the probability of women making it to the top management also reduces significantly. So the first, I think one of the things that is important to do is kind of keep investing in women who join the sector, who are in the middle management, and think of systems that work to support them, and so that you're creating that base for more women to get into senior leadership positions. And secondly, all the data that you just cited shows the lack of women in this space. But I think even today, when it comes to research and data, we don't really understand how each crisis affects women differently than men. And unless you have that information available, that lens, that gender lens, and just understanding a problem and designing solutions around the problem will never happen. So I think a lot of focus, therefore, also has to come in understanding what this crisis means for women as a group. And again, looking at the intersections, like Arunabha mentioned earlier, like it's not just about gender, but looking at gender in confluence with class, geography, religion, and other factors. I think, I hope that answers your question. I'm just trying to give this.
Yes, absolutely. Do either of the other panelists want to jump in on this question? Okay, then we'll move on to the next one. I think that was a great answer. So the next one is really on the topic of the transition of sustainability and including women in power and gender equality. We know that gender equality is one of the UN, United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Konkanita, how would you describe the relationship between the overall transition to sustainability and the progress of gender equality?
Thank you so much, Julia, for your introduction and question, and for moderating the session, and everyone else for setting the context so well. As you rightly pointed out, gender equality is actually SDG 5, which looks at it as a major goal towards developing going towards sustainable development. In fact, it's also important to note that, we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but it is foundational to many other SDG targets as well. So I work on the water sector, and here the disproportionate brunt which women and girls face is very clear, especially when we're talking about access to water. And this ends up, becoming impinges on their education, their income earning opportunities, and their socio-cultural and political involvement eventually. So, and so very clearly, gender is not just about SDG 5, but all the other development goals are intrinsically linked to it. And this was talked about earlier as well. I think we cannot anymore talk about gender equality without looking at addressing and acknowledging other cross-cutting, socioeconomic factors as well, right? Like caste, income, family responsibilities, patriarchy, etc. And therefore, the whole issue of gender equality therefore becomes a very complex topic. Now, when it comes to workplaces, gender equality and leadership, it is well known that there are implicit biases which has led to certain unwanted aspects, like the gender pay gap. For instance, in India, if a man is earning 100 rupees, a woman would be earning 78 rupees. That's the latest statistics for that. We also end up seeing a lot of unfair policies which do not take into account such gender perspective. The maternity and paternity leaves in India is 26 weeks versus 15 days. So for 15 days for paternity leave. So while we are designing these policies, we should probably start looking at not reinforcing stereotypes, and instead give more nuanced thought while designing them. So issues like this end up limiting the career growth of women in organizations. We see a high attrition rate, generally in organizations. One 2018 ILO report actually reported that in India, I know a lot of people are from different parts of the world, but I'm talking about some India numbers. So at the women at the entry level is at like 24% representation. When you get to senior management, it reduces a bit to 19%. And when you look at top leadership roles, it's only around 3%, 2.7%. So so starting at the managerial level, there are significantly fewer women to promote. And as we go ahead, I think it is very important to focus on this hollow middle, as also talked about by the McKinsey report, which calls this the middle management issue a hollow middle. So what happens as a result is, when you have less women in leadership positions, you also have less women as mentors and role models for early career professionals. So it's a cycle which keeps repeating. So in order to look at addressing the hollow middle, one should start having frequent conversations about gender and intersectionality. And the onus of this does not lie on women alone. Everybody should come forward and try to acknowledge and address these issues. Sasmita and Arunabha touched about women in sustainability a bit. So through this initiative, we are trying to do exactly this, trying to create that space where women in public policy can move ahead in their careers, and to see how organizations can support. So in that way, we are trying, our endeavor is to create a conducive work environment which can encourage the careers of women. we also are looking at ways in which we can develop more impactful work policies, which balance the professional and personal, which Sasmita mentioned about, and create equitable opportunities for both men and women to go ahead and showcase their work. So once we are able to ensure these things, we'll probably have more women in leadership roles, and therefore the women leaders can also inspire students and early career professionals, and hopefully we will be able to close some of these gaps which exist. Thank you.
Such a good and comprehensive answer. Thank you so much. I actually thought of a bunch of questions myself while listening to you. So I want to invite all of our attendees, if you have questions about anything that the panelists are saying, please write them in the question and answer box right below, and we'll try to address them in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. And of course, if we answer them during the webinar, that's great as well. Would either one of the other panelists like to build off what she was saying, or can we move on to the next question? All right, looks like we can move on. The next question is really about decision making. Women are statistically more conscious about sustainability as a topic and a sector. How come most corporate decision makers for sustainability are men? Leah, I would love to hear from you about what you have to think on this topic.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'll just briefly introduce myself because you've had a lot of content in the past half hour. So I'm Leah Friedman. I work currently at the French Red Cross in a program that seeks to create collaborations in between the French Red Cross and NGOs or startups that work on the same topics as the Red Cross. So to answer your question, Julia, about women on one side being statistically more conscious about sustainability as a topic and sector, and on the other side not being that much involved in the decision-making processes. I actually love this question in this situation of the COVID crisis, because in my opinion, it really raises an important question of what power we give to value created for society. I'll take a quick example, and with the fact that today we know that in the COVID crisis, the most exposed jobs, the ones that were in the front line of the COVID crisis, such as caregivers, nurses, or cashiers, are jobs that are for most jobs more than 70% occupied by women. And those jobs are also amongst the ones that were most vulnerable during the crisis, but also in general, those are sectors in the medical social sector, for instance, where 1 out of 10 people regularly are victims of work accidents. And I'm pointing this out because I think that this crisis actually questions us on what value we attribute to those kind of jobs that we know we can't do without. And so the sector as a whole is obviously, as was said as an introduction, a victim of the same power play as anywhere else in the world when it comes to sitting at the table. So we have an overrepresentation of women being caregivers, being nurses, being cashiers, and globally being more involved in the business of care. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, that's not really the question. They're overwhelmingly present, and when it comes to being at the table, they're less and less there. And I think that that's pretty interesting in the way it highlights what gender dynamics questions us on. For any corporate, any big organization to question itself about gender dynamics, it raises the question of working conditions, it raises the question of discrimination, it raises the question of governance, power plays, it raises the questions of making employees more autonomous, making each person more responsible, and of seeing work in KPIs through the lens of social and environmental value created. So what I wanted to highlight with those examples is that in the end, I think having more women with decision capacities in the workplace and having sustainability being more important in the workplace are actually one and the same topic, because as you have more and more women in power, and as you have more and more sustainability being central in the business, well, you create a formidable opportunity to actually rethink what you value as a society and what you value in your business. And I'll finish this quite long answer by highlighting that sustainability is actually a really interesting opportunity for women to find a voice in the workplace. For instance, my own job didn't exist at the Red Cross 5 years ago. We didn't have an innovation department at the Red Cross 5 years ago. And we're seeing that sustainability really creates opportunities with jobs that are more agile, jobs where we need to innovate a lot, and so where we are requiring different skills, different capacities, and reinventing the way we actually work. So I think seeing those two as a common objective make a lot of sense in the workplace.
Thank you, Leah. That was a complex but a very interesting answer, and I'm glad we got to hear about how the Red Cross and how COVID have impacted your thoughts on this. And I'm sure the audience is sending lots of questions through, and I think they'll have some more questions for you at the end on the subject. I will go on to the next question. This is for Shasmita and Leah. So you guys both, you have experience in social entrepreneurship, and I would love to hear from both of you how we can leverage social entrepreneurship to engage women in power positions. Perhaps Shasmita, you'd like to start us off, and then we can hear from Leah afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there is a lot of opportunity in the way businesses can become agents of change and can become the medium through which we achieve gender equality. Interestingly, we are currently doing a project right now. It's called Powering Livelihoods, where we are supporting a few energy enterprises to help reach markets and access consumers and build a larger ecosystem, which would in turn have impact on livelihoods and creation of job opportunities in rural India. The interesting part is, like, a gender lens is very inclusive in the project itself. And when we talk about gender lens, it's not just about investing in companies by women, it's also about ensuring that companies that are run by men are equally gender inclusive, which means you're looking at gender equity in top management, you're looking at increasing women's participation in value chain, you're increasing the target of products, goods and services for women. You're also, as a result, you're increasing the end users basically who are women. And when it comes to livelihood, these are women who will be able to use these products and generate an income for themselves. However, this is possible because of three things coming together. One is a donor or an investor who is willing to experiment and invest in such an idea, where the push for gender inclusion is coming from with that additional incentive that here's the pool of money that we are allowing you to invest in gender inclusion. Secondly, the internal capacity of a team to be able to nuance the impact and the methods through which you achieve gender inclusion. Because the way in which you would reach a male customer may not be the same in which you reach a woman customer. So understanding that difference. And thirdly, being part of an institutional ecosystem or a sectoral ecosystem that is encouraging of these kind of progressive ideas. And if one of these things is not in place, you are not able to leverage that opportunity. So I do feel social enterprises have a lot to do as agents of change in this space. But I also feel like a lot of this will have to come along with push from donors, investors, and organizations to gradually move towards a gender lens, not just invest in companies by women, but also look at gender inclusion in companies that are started by men. Because whether we like it or not, there are a lot more companies that are being founded by men than are by women. So while it's important to invest in women-owned companies, maybe it will take us a few years to reach a proportion where women are starting the same number of companies as men. So until then, we need to invest in gender inclusion. And secondly, like Konkanika said, why should it only be the responsibility of women to focus on gender inclusion? It should be given for any enterprise or any company that's being started. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll add on to that. Maybe a few important numbers to start off with this question. How can we leverage social entrepreneurship to engage women in leadership position? I think one of the important things to recall is that social entrepreneurship has values of freedom, equality, and solidarity that maybe entrepreneurship of the market economy doesn't place in the center. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to keep in mind, is that social entrepreneurship sees money as a means and not as an end. So that will build on to my answer as I go. I think it's so important to ourselves of the fact that in social entrepreneurship, we have a majority of women being employees and beneficiaries, actually, but obviously a minority of them being employed on high qualification jobs and high responsibilities. That being said, men and women go into social entrepreneurship for the same reasons. And the three main are being useful, answering an unmet need, and professional opportunity. So we have, again, an overwhelmingly majority of women being involved in the field, both men and women going into social entrepreneurship for the same reasons, but still the same kind of bias of women being on lower qualification jobs. A few very quick numbers about the pay. In social entrepreneurship, you have more than half of the women, in France at least, who are paid 1,000 to 2,000 euros a month. And you have more than half men who are paid over 2,000 euros a month. So I think it's interesting to find also the pay gap in the social entrepreneurship sector. And so I'll come to how we can leverage social entrepreneurship now. The main obstacles that women face in social entrepreneurship are they find it harder to convince people. They find it harder to find a business model, mostly lacking financial skills. They find it harder to have trust from VCs. And above all, most interestingly, they find it harder to trust themselves than men. And one key figure that I find fascinating is that more than 40% of women in social entrepreneurship say that they, above all, need coaching in an accelerator or an incubator, while more than half of the men say that they don't need any coaching or any advice from anyone to start their own business. So I think that brings us to what we have to do to create more opportunities for women in the social entrepreneurship field. We need obviously more coaching and more empowering communities. We need more VCs started by women or policies for specific funding. And we need desire and inspiration to become entrepreneurs. And I was said earlier, I think creating role models is a very important point. I think social entrepreneurship has the advantage over big corporations that I was talking about earlier to be decentralized and private initiatives. So in my view, it's way easier to sort of break into the house through that door than through big corporations that will take ages to change because they have such strong history and such strong habits. So I think we really have to kind of embrace the opportunity that social entrepreneurship is offering us, which is the opportunity of decentralized power and private initiative. And I think really social entrepreneurship will be coherent the day its governance is actually in harmony with the objectives it fixes itself, which is to promote a society that is based on values of equality, inclusion, freedom, and solidarity.
Thank you, Leia and Shasmita. Super cohesive answers, and I love seeing the difference in your answers from two different perspectives. I want to move on to our very important but last question, which we will hear from all of the panelists. And it's really what is at the core of this webinar. How can we get women in power in sustainability? And what are the first steps to achieving this goal? Especially for the audience, what are concrete actions that we can all take to unlock women's sustainability leadership potential? I'd love to hear from all three of you. Maybe we can start with Kankanita, after Shasmita, and finalizing with Leia.
Thank you, Julia. I wanted to specifically talk about one of the interventions that we are looking at. It's a work in progress, but we have started it around a year and a year back. This is called the gender KPIs. The idea behind this is to monitor how we are progressing. So while it's important to look at how we, dispelling biases, make like women stepping up, we should also see what how we are progressing in that direction. For this, based on, so what we basically did was based on our main focus areas, our criteria, we identified some indicators which can be measured, and we report it every year so that we know we have a check on how things are progressing. So this is one step that one can take. Earlier, I spoke about mentorship, and I think that becomes crucial for organizations to enable. And therefore, both these gender KPIs, monitoring, and also mentorship will be my points for this. Shasmita.
Yeah. A couple of points that I want to add to this would be, so data tells us that about 70% of investment globally in women come from women investors. Now, when we are looking at businesses or putting women in control or even enabling women to take positions of power, a lot more investment has to come from conventional donors, conventional investors, firstly. In addition to what Konkanika said around gender KPIs, we have been monitoring that across all teams, across all hierarchies. The next transition would probably be to look at targets, like where do we want to reach? So in 5 years from now, where do organizations want to reach? How do they see themselves outdoing their peers in the sector, or even matching sectoral benchmarks, or maybe benchmarks of another sector which is considered progressive. We did a study and we found that in renewable energy sector, in solar rooftop companies actually, the women's participation is only 11%, which is much lower than the global average of 32%. And this is India percentage I'm talking about. But even 32% globally is much lower than sectors like tech and computers and financial services, which have seen a lot more women come in. So maybe there are lessons from those industries to try and understand what is it that we can emulate and kind of bring into our sectors, respective sectors, to kind of improve participation of women. The third thing that I feel is equally important is working with positive masculinities. which is how do you leverage role models among men, and also redefining the idea of being a man and kind of increasing the responsibilities and roles of men in enabling this larger cause, whether as partners, whether as company managers, as leaders, as investors, in whatever role they are in. Sometimes they must be in multiple roles. Trying to understand how we can bring in positive masculinities as a concept to talk about, and then build on that and see how men can be an active participant in supporting women to achieve this goal. And the final point that I think it's not just sustainability sector specific, but in general, the global report on the state of world's fathers reports that if men were to do 50 minutes of additional household work and women 50 minutes less, we would achieve gender equity much faster. So while we are talking about increasing participation of women in decision-making positions, in economic activities, so to speak, unless we also start talking about role of men in unpaid care work, we are not going to be able to achieve a balancing figure in professional setups, because the work isn't going anywhere. Like, there is still that amount of work that exists, which both have to do. And therefore, while we talk about women in economic activities, we also have to talk about men in unpaid care work. And again, thinking about positive masculinities will be very important. Involving men in these discussions will be very important. Thank you.
Thanks to you too. I think positive masculinity is a very important topic. I'll try a very down to earth answer to that question. I think I literally could write like 1,000 pages on what I think we should rebuild as a model to involve more women. But I'd like to have an answer that really concerns everyone. And distinctly, like whatever the sector you work in, whoever you are, basically, I think there are 3 major steps that we don't do enough on, each and every one of us. The first one is understanding, the second one is noticing, and the third one is speaking up. And I think that's really like the 3 major steps that each citizen should take in this sort if they want to act on gender issues. First one is understanding, and it's understanding yourself first as a man or as a woman, understanding what the reasons are for choosing the career path that you choose. If as a woman at some point you thought about finance and didn't go for it, do you know why? Is there a gender bias in this or not? It's actually sometimes a very painful conversation to have with yourself, but I think it's really, really like the start to any profound understanding of what gender dynamics are about. So understanding as a man or as a woman. As a man, also have the courage to also question some of your practices, some of the way you talk to people, you talk in a group of people. So understanding the power dynamics that you are part of as a citizen. Second step is noticing, starting noticing around you what dynamics are happening. Like in a reunion, do you notice whether or not women have had the space to speak up? Do they actually speak up when they have the space to do so? And I think that's really like a daily thing at the workplace or at school or even in your families. And the more you notice, the more it actually makes sense to you what the whole gender theory is about. So understanding, noticing, and then third one is speaking up. And there I'll focus a little bit on the sustainability sector. It should be way easier to speak up in the sustainability sector because it's a matter of coherence of values. You cannot be in the sustainability sector and not have a balanced governance. It doesn't make any sense. So it should be in the heart and in the like focus of everyone in the sustainability sector to be able to speak up about the gender issue. And in the other sectors, obviously, it's also important. Though it's a discourse that is a little bit different, maybe a little less focused on values, maybe on other KPIs. But again, I think in the sustainability sector, really focus on the coherence of values. So understand, notice, and speak up.
Thank you. That was super clear and really inspiring from all of you. That concludes our official questions for this webinar, but we have quite a few really interesting questions from our audience. So thank you first, participants, for being so engaged and wanting to know more about this topic. I'm going to try to make a couple groups of these questions so you can identify a bit clearer and answer some of them. We won't get to all of them, unfortunately, but maybe the panelists, if you did receive some of them, you can always maybe answer by email after if it's really pressing. I will try and have this audience Q&A around 7 to 8 minutes. Let's try to keep it under that so we can have a couple closing remarks. Perhaps the Dr. Arupana Ganesh, and I'm sorry for your pronunciation of your name, can have a couple final comments, and then to finish up with Sushil and myself. So to start off our Q&A, I would like to keep talking actually about this issue and this discussion around masculinity, positive and negative. So we have the question about positive masculinity. What about manifestation of feminine qualities within an institution? And I would like to combine that with the second question, which is what kind of processes can be instituted that could prevent structural bias trickling into workspaces? Which can also kind of talk with a third question, which is how do we make sure there is not an ego clash when women raise an issue in the workplace, and how can you circumvent this type of situation? Perhaps one of our panelists would like to start.
I can talk about the positive masculinities and kind of give you a few examples to begin with. And of course, this will vary from context to context and depending on the power dynamics, and again, intersection of class privileges and regional other kinds of privileges as well, in addition to gender. For example, as employees, I think it's important to work with the unconscious biases that managers may have. Now, most managers, if they are men, they would have these biases. And then how do you kind of design, how do you use tools and trainings to be able to sensitize more and more managers to be more aware and alert about these biases? Because we talk a lot about female mentorship, but we do not kind of give equal importance to understanding what these biases are, where they are coming from, and how do we address these biases. Similarly, calling out behavior practices within the workspace or policies within the workspace that you think are not gender inclusive, and kind of bringing that to the forefront and having a conversation about it or trying to address them. Being mentors and being guides to women who show promise, to kind of help them navigate this power structure, help them navigate these barriers that they face within the industry. Similarly, creating a safe space where conversations or points or unpleasant discussions that are brought up are taken more seriously, are taken in the right spirit, and the orientation is towards like, let's try and address this problem. As leaders, you can become role models where you kind of set the right values, you create an inclusive workplace culture. You're taking a stance on very heteronormative positions of what men should be doing and what women should be doing. One example could be like if your organization is being overtly discriminatory with respect to field work, right? Like, oh, only men can go to the field and women can't. Then you try and break that bias and encourage and create the systems and the facilities through which more women can actually also go to the field and get that exposure as and when needed as part of their jobs. Again, things like language. How do you kind of how do you kind of set the decorum in terms of addressing men and women in your teams, like being conscious if you're treating your male colleagues and female colleagues differently. So there are a lot of these things that can be done, including gender sensitization workshops, to be able to deal with these biases and work on positive masculinities. I'm talking from an organizational perspective. There are like a lot of other contexts that we can also talk about.
Thank you, Shasmita. Did anyone want to build off her point before we move on to the next question?
I saw a question about how has been our experience in getting men on board, including them. I mean, it has been a struggle to get everyone getting in more men to attend our meetings. But over the years, I think the participation has increased. So now but still, like, we would want to do better, and it is the onus also remains on men to come and join these conversations. So one of the experience which I want to specifically talk about is this recent workshop we organized on menstruation. I think that was a positive experience for both the genders, and at least we were able to discuss some of the issues freely, like even something like, I'm having cramps, I might want to take a work from home. That conversation might be very difficult, but with so many years of trying to talk about these, I think those situations are improving, just based on my experience with WIS and my organization. Sasmita, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, nothing major, but yes, the effort has always been to include more men. And it's often been easier to get men into the discussion through women. Like, for example, if I want to invite my mentors or people I think have made a positive contribution in my life, they are already converts and they are willing to kind of understand these nuances. Similarly, a lot of our trainings at the organizational level are mandatory for all. So we have conducted gender sensitization workshops as well, which is open to, for everybody has to attend, so that at least all of us are at the same level of the basic understanding around these gender differences. So we have been trying to do things here and there to be able to get more men into the conversation, and sometimes it's valuable because a lot of men kind of come from their point of experience, and when they make those points, it becomes easier for us to have a conversation, because they would come and say, but what about this or what about that? So then it opens space for far more nuanced conversation. And if you think of it on a broader like a broader agenda of sorts, we are talking about redefining work lives and redefining personal lives, right? So it's a conversation which is equally material for men and women. And I think using that discourse has helped us bring more men into the conversation. Again, focusing on positive masculinities has helped us bring more men into the conversation. Yeah, so I think there are tools like this which can encourage greater participation. We can continue to leverage them.
Thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, but we have one more question we'd love to answer before we do our closing remarks. So hopefully everyone can spare an extra 3 or 4 minutes of their day to discuss with us. The next question is about a career in sustainability. So for a career in sustainability, what steps a young woman should be taking or should take as a young professional? Leia, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Again, I'll try and be very down to earth. I think the main sort of advantage you can have in the sustainability career is have a systemic understanding of issues. And I think to do that, in order to do that, there are two very simple things that you can do. The first one is read the news every day, all day, just read the news. And the second one is meeting everyone that you can in the sector. Literally, like every person that works in sustainability, whether in fashion, whether in the energy industry, whether in finance, even if it's not the career that you want to get into or the angle that you want to take to tackle the sustainability issue, meet everyone, contact them on LinkedIn. It's actually a fact that people involved in sustainability are way more accessible than people involved in the more classic market economy, because it's, again, part of the values of the industry. So don't hesitate. You will have positive answers, I don't doubt it. And I think you'll get a competitive advantage over other candidates in the industry if you start with those two very basic steps.
Thank you, Leia. Unfortunately, we are really running out of time. I see we still have quite a few questions left from our audience. The panelists have said that they might be able to answer specific ones by email, so we will try to send a follow-up email answering some of these really interesting questions to you guys after the webinar. Of course, if you have more, don't hesitate to write them quickly before it ends. I would like to invite back up Shishil to do a quick conclusion with me together. Thank you guys so much for your time today, for spending this hour talking about women and sustainability with us and women in power. It's clearly an issue that we can't solve overnight, but like our panelists said, it will take us going hand in hand, male and female, all together, and every little action that we can do will help. So without further ado, I'd really like to thank our three panelists for your insights again, Shashnita, Konkanita, and Leia. It was a pleasure having you. And I'll pass it off to Shishil. Thank you so much, guys. I was your moderator for the day, and have a lovely afternoon. Shishil?
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. And all the speakers, the panelists, and all the organizations involved. It was quite an interesting and insightful discussion we had today. A lot of views and opinions, very interesting, shared by the panelists. And also the Q&A, very interesting questions as well. I mean, there are a lot of key takeaways from this webinar, but maybe I'll just, for me, there were two key takeaways which I wanted to share, and then I'll let Julia, do the final closing of this webinar. For me, what I took away from this webinar is that gender equality is it's more than SDG 5. It's basically looking at sustainability as a whole. It's a holistic issue. We have to look at the entire value chain when we have the inclusivity and women being a part of the society and organization. And it was kind of shared by Susmita as well. And we had Leah talking about how this is an interesting opportunity, sustainability being an interesting opportunity for women, and the jobs being agile and the skills required. And we had interesting data being shared by Konkanika about the fact that productivity is increased with women being in the workforce. So all of these leads to positively that we should have more women in leadership positions. So with this, I'll let Julia do the final closings of this webinar, and thank you again for your participation.
Great summary. I couldn't have done it better. Yes, just a final thank you, guys. Thank you, SASICO. Thank you, YEast. Thank you, CEW. Thank you, Red Cross. And thank you to all the others around the world who care about this issue and want to make a difference. We will be having more webinars in the future, so if you found this one interesting, don't hesitate to reach out or stay tuned for any future ones. Thank you guys, and have a lovely, lovely day, lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Pauline.
Everyone.
Sushil.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.